Hi guys, this is Boomer for PokerStrategy.com, and in this video we're going to be looking back on a session that I played at 2-4 on PokerStars recently. A couple of you have requested a video from Stars, so I was happy to do so. It's more than likely that this video is going to take the form of two parts, mainly because the session went a little longer than I'd expected. Plus I was playing on fast tables at the time, which meant I was getting a lot of hands in, and the action started flying in the sort of later parts of the session, so I'm actually probably got a few more hands than in my last video on Party to Go and talk out in a few more concepts. Just to things to look out for in this video and potentially the next one. I have one tag particularly who is on both of my tables, and it's just how we can play differently against him than we would against the weaker opposition that there is at the table. There's a couple of hands which come up where, due to the fact that a tight aggressive player has a much more predictable range, that we can take a lot more exploitable and exploitative lines. Also, as I did mention, the action does start hotting up in late position, so just something to be on the lookout for, that in late position generally, when you end up with wide ranges and fairly aggressive players, you are going to get a lot of attempts by one player or another to start outwitting their opponents through one means or another, so it's just interesting to have a look at that. Another thing to notice is that I do take quite a few notes during the session. If I end a session where I've played with the same players for, even if it's just half an hour or so, if I don't have a note on them by the end of the session, even if it's just telling me that he seems like a decent taggy player, then I'm usually fairly disappointed with myself. I try and stay very alert, or as alert as I can, at the tables. If I feel like I'm not alert at the tables, of course you're very rarely going to be playing your best game, and a lot of times you should probably do something else if you're not capable of focusing at that time. And the final thing is dealing with potential mistakes you or your opponents make. I'm not going to lie, I don't think I play perfectly in this video by any means. I think I probably make a couple of mistakes that in hindsight I would not have made. However, obviously with things going pretty quickly as they do, and the fact that it is in a live setting where you can't just take 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes to go through every single hand, occasionally you are going to make mistakes. It's just important to try and get yourself back on an even keel to do so. And obviously mistakes your opponents make when they make a horrendous peel, or they make a ridiculously bad bluff, or they suck out on you, etc. It's important to react in a way where we're still conscious of what we're doing. What I'm going to do just before we get into the live action is, there were a couple of hands which happened before the camera started recording, so I'm just going to take you through those in the hand replayer. A couple of concepts came up, and I just want to go through these just as a sort of precursor to the session, and then we'll jump into the live action, and I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks very much. So in this first hand I have King Jack off on the button. I've not removed any of the names for this one because you're going to be seeing them anyway, so I didn't really see the point. Cut off, short stack, limps, very standard isolation play. The small blind calls 2 cold or 1.5 cold. Big blind comes along getting an insane price, and the cutoff just calls. I wouldn't have been surprised to see Nicey Girl go all in there, but we've got a decent hand against that sort of range. The flop is 10-7-5 with 2 diamonds. Now, it's checked to me, and I make a slightly weird play in that I actually check behind here. The reason for this being that there's 3 cards in the middle playing zone here. So any sort of suited connectory style hand isn't going to fold on this board. It's more than likely the pot's going to be protected anyway by the short stack, so I don't see much value here in turning king high into a bluff at this point. There's a lot of hands that we can catch on the turn. It's like we can obviously catch a king or jack, we can catch a diamond, we can catch a queen. We can even catch sort of an ace, but mainly it's the hands which can give us flush draws, outside straight draws and pairs. So there's a lot of cards that we can catch here, and if we do bet out here, we're not really betting for value, and if we get raised, what we're mainly doing is charging ourselves for the draw that we hold in what's more than likely going to be a protected pot, and that's not really something that I want to be doing. We're not going to pick up the pot ever here, I don't think, unimproved. And king high I just don't think has enough equity here to be betting for anything like value. So I check behind in this situation. I think if I had maybe the if I had like ace of diamonds, jack of hearts, then a continuation bet makes a lot more sense. We've got a lot more showdown value. Our backdoor draws to the nuts, etc. I kind of like it in that circumstance, but I think here checking behind is a perfectly reasonable alternative. And the turn does help us. It's the queen of clubs. From here it's fairly standard. It's betting to us. The cutoff goes all in, so now there's really no point in raising whatsoever. The pot's protected, even if DDP Vegas is bluffing at it with the diamond draw or something like that. There's still no point in raising. So I just call, and the small blind calls. And wouldn't you know who won the pony on the river? It's an ace of hearts, so we have the nuts, and unfortunately I bet and everyone folds. And a bit of a beat for the cutoff. Had 2 power on the river and it just wasn't good enough. So we dragged that pot. In this next hand I've got 8-6 of diamonds in the small blind. It's folded to us, and this is a pretty standard open. It's a little towards the bottom of my range, but I would open this against pretty much any big blind, unless I thought again he had a real edge on me. Occasionally you might think about open limping the small blind, but that's only if you're against a hyper aggressive big blind who you think's very good. And then you might want to start open limping with some of your range, if not all of it, just to keep your range hidden. Anyway, big blind calls. The flop's ace-3-4. It's a good board for us to represent. We're going to get quite a few folds on a board like this, so we lead out, which is standard, and the big blind calls. The turn gives us an open-ended straight draw, and it also gives us the fact that we're drawing to the highest possible straight, just to make things a little bit better for us, because obviously our 8 plays if we hit the 7. 2-barreling is probably okay here, because he may peel the flop with something like Queen Jack of diamonds, or so some hand which has like backdoor flush draw potential. He may have a 3 which he might be willing to let go of now. It's a little bit thin, but again we have 8 high. The 5 may hit his range a bit, but I would have expected him to fight back a bit if he'd have had sort of a big-ish pair or a bigger hand pre-flop. But we lead out, and now he calls. So he's called in 2 situations here. I think that his most likely hand is going to be a pair at this point in time. He may be getting really weak with a bad ace, but all bad aces now either have two pairs or a straight, so it's unlikely he's got that. He may have a 4, he may have a 3 that he's just not letting go of. So at this point we really should be looking at shutting down on the river. The river's the 9 of diamonds, which is a complete brick. If he has a hand like King 3 or Queen 3 or something like that, if he didn't fold the turn, he's not going to fold that river. So I think I actually make a pretty poor play here and barrel. It was a kind of a bad thought process barrel, I'd say. Something on the lines of I have 8 high, so I have to bet here. You don't have to bet in a situation like this. If your opponent's pretty much repping a pair here, he's not going anywhere with it. There's not going to be that many hands you're going to bluff off. I mean, fine, he may have check called with like Queen high, hoping that he's on 6 outs, and now you're going to get him to fold. But if he's got any sort of legitimate hand whatsoever, he's not folding it on the river. We're getting 5-1 as a price on our bluff, so he's got to fold about 16% of the time here for the bluff to be profitable. I don't think he's going to fold that amount. If we were getting a slightly better price, say someone just dumped $20 into the pot at random, then sure, take a shot at it. But I think we're asking a little too much for him to fold 1 in 6 times here. And we do get picked off by Jack 4, which is pretty much standard. Pretty much representing what he had there. And pretty much burning most of a bet on the river there with that barrel. But it is a barrel that you'll see an awful lot from players, and I'm a little disappointed in myself that I made this barrel overall. And in the final hand before we get to the live action, I've got Jack 9 off in the small blind. The button limp, showing that I've got myself into what's probably a pretty good game here. I raise, big blind folds, button calls. The flop's ace 3-3 with 2 spades on it. This is a total nothing flop. But it would be a flop where, because we've taken the initiative pre-flop, I would expect to get quite a few folds on this flop. We lead, and the button now calls us. Now, he's a weak player, so he may have a flush draw. He may have an ace, he may have a pair of some description. But if he does have those hands, he's not going to be folding them for the most part. And at this point, I'm already feeling a little bit worried about our range here. Even against a passive player here, I'm pretty worried about what our hand looks like at this point in time. We may have to barrel the turn just to fold out some of the hands that may have called with backdoor draws, etc. But at this point I'm feeling a little bit worried about our hand overall and whether we can profitably bluff it down at this point. The turn's the king of spades. Now, there is a temptation here to go for a barrel and try and get him to fold a pair by the river, but if we really think about it, how big of a part of a range is of his range is a pocket pair in this situation? The guy's fairly loose passive from what I've seen, but it's not a huge part combo wise. There's going to be a million hands that have now picked up a flush draw. He may already have a flush, he may have a weak ace, and to be honest, at this point, getting raised here is pretty awful because he could have some 7-8 suited, some 6-7 suited, some 5-4s, etc. Just low suited connectors where we're drawing live, but we've just charged ourselves the maximum to draw to our hand. If we check, the odds are we could get a free card from a pocket pair, which again is also okay because we're drawing live. And if he does bet into us, the odds are he's got us pretty much beat at this point. I'm not a huge fan of bluffing here with the one card flush draw. We can get our opponent off some kind of flush draw by the river, but that has to work quite a large proportion of the time because we're betting $8 into a pot that's probably only going to be $26 on the river, so it's got to work a pretty significant proportion of the time. We're talking sort of 1 in 3 there, so it's got to work 33% of the time. I honestly don't think it's going to work that often. So at this point I actually check the turn. I am intending to check call. I'm certainly not intending to check fold at this point. If he does bet the turn and the river, well, obviously we're going to fold because we've only got jack high. But if he does bet the turn and the river, I'd actually think he's pretty strong here. We may even fold a 9 on the river. It's just not a good card for us at all. But he does bet, and I call. And the river's the best card in the deck for us, pretty much, the Queen of Spades, and I make a bit of a blunder here. I should have bet out. Fact is, we've got the third best possible flush in this situation. Our opponent, if he does have a pair, if he has an ace, he may check back this river. Mainly just due to the fact that passive players get scared when they see 4 flushes. If he does have a weak ace, there's probably not a huge amount I'm paying him off with here. So really, checking back, I wouldn't fault him for doing it. Because the way I've repped my hand at this point, it looks very much like a flush draw, but I'm not sure if I can put a loose passive player on that sort of thought process. Unfortunately for me, he does bet the river. I call. I was actually feeling pretty bad when he bet the river there, but he shows up with the nut low flush and top pair. So my check on the turn is, from the results, it's justified. But I think overall it was a decent play against his overall range, because when you're peeled on a flop like that, especially from someone who is a fairly passive player, and then a scary card like that comes on the turn, you often don't have the bluff equity that you think you have, or it's going to cost you just far too much to 3-barrel the river. So anyway, at this point, having seen these 3 hands, we will move on to the live play. So welcome to the action, guys. I will attempt to keep things as active as possible. This is the first hand on the left hand table. We have ace 8 off on the button and open. And a small blind, who seems to be a loose aggressive player, 3-bets us. We call, and the flop is 8-7-7 with 2 spades on it. To be honest, I don't really mind which way you're going to take this overall. You can raise the flop right here, or you can wait until the turn. I decide with the board texture as it is to wait until the turn. The reason for this mainly being that paired boards are extremely hard to hit for value. So I tend to not raise them on the flop that much. Obviously, if you've got a flush draw here, you've got massive equity and you might want to capitalise on that. But this is a board where he's going to fire twice pretty much come what may, so you can always raise the turn. And the fact is that on paired boards such as this, you often don't have a lot of fold equity with your flush draws and your straight draws, etc. So a lot of the time it's really, I wouldn't say wrong, but it's not as good as you would expect to raise with every semi-bluff in your arsenal on this sort of board, just mainly because it's so hard to hit for value, and thus you're going to polarize your range more to bluffs. Also, the fact is, if we're going to get called down by ace high here, I expect him to call down with ace high on almost any turn anyway. So I really don't think that we lose much by waiting till the turn here. I think it just makes things that little bit easier for us. On these sort of low flops, I tend to think that waiting for the turn is a little bit better, just to protect the range that you're going to be peeling on the flop. Say we had a hand here like ace 10 off with the ace of spades, we'd obviously want to peel that. So I think that it's a decent way of hiding your peeling range on this flop, not making it too obvious what you have when you just call the flop here. So I do call. He bets turn, and I go ahead with my plan, and he 3-bets almost instantaneously on the turn. A lot of the time this does mean overpair, but he could be turning a hand like 9-10, he could be 3-bet semi-bluffing me, he is fairly aggressive. If he thinks I could be free showdown raising with a hand like pocket 2s here or something like that, he may well put in a 3-bet. It obviously looks fairly bad for us at this point, but this early on in the session with a guy who looks this aggressive, I'm looking towards showdown here. I have top pair. He is representing an overpair, but if he does have an overpair and a flop top pair, you're going to lose money to a loose aggressive player. So I'm looking towards showdown here unless a really bad card comes on the river. That would actually count as a really bad card on the river, and now he checks to us on the river, and I've got to admit this really confused me. If he had an overpair like 10s or obviously queens, kings, aces, that river should not frighten him in the least. Sure, I could have a flush draw, but obviously there's a tons of 8s in my range. I could have a hand like 6s as well. There really is just no reason not to be betting here with a pair, especially with someone as aggressive as him. So really, the only hands I could put in his range at this point were either he had a total bluff which has somehow missed despite every draw coming in, or he was going for a check raise on the river. So at this point I actually look at the hand and think I probably don't have value in a bet. He may have a hand like king 8 or queen 8 suited here, but I can't really think that he wouldn't value bet that on the river either. So he's really got me a little bit confused here as to what he's got in his hand here, and I honestly think that with a range where he's going to be either check raising or check folding, that there wasn't a huge amount of value in a bet. I'm willing to accept that I may be wrong, but I think that overall checking behind here isn't a bad play if you feel like you're dealing with someone who is a thinking player. As it turns out, my presumption was wrong, and he actually shows ace-10 off suit here. This is a pretty brutally bad turn raise, turn 3-bet as it were. It's not one that a lot of players are going to make, but it's one where someone's going to try and he's basically saying to himself, I think my opponent has a large amount of bluffs in his range, therefore I have the best hand and should raise. This is awful with a hand like ace-10 off. He should more be thinking of his hand, well, if my opponent's bluffing, he probably is going to fire the river anyway, so therefore I get 3-bets one way or the other. Turning ace-10 off into a bluff to try and get me off a hand like a 5 or a pair of 2s, 3s or 4s here makes no sense, because I'm probably showdown bound with those hands anyway. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense for me to be free showdown raising those hands in the first place. So I really don't get his line. If he's turning his hand into a bluff, he should bluff the river, because that is probably the one card he's going to get me to fold a lot of pairs like 2, 3s, 4s or ace-5 or a hand like that on. I really don't understand his play here. I think that turn 3-bet is pretty bad. Obviously it worked out well for me overall, but once he's raised on the turn, I wouldn't blame him for calling down whatsoever, although if I fired that river he could probably let go of ace-10, just because sort of 9-10 got there, the obvious draw got there, and I'm obviously going to be raising pretty much all pairs in my range on the turn as well, so he can probably let go of ace-10 if I fire the river there. But I really don't get the logic behind his turn 3-bet. I think that it's pretty bad, and I take a note instantly on it, because you've really got to notice when your opponents are going to do something like this. So I drag that pot and we move back on to normal play. Just got a couple of trash hands here. As you notice, the tables are quite... these tables are fast tables, so we're really ripping through hands here, or going to be. You'll notice me taking a note there. Pretty standard open with King 9 off from the hijack. It might be worth me folding it just due to the fact that there's a player who's so aggressive to my immediate left, but because he's been caught with his hand in the cookie jar in the last hand, I'm more happy to open in a situation like that. 9-10 suited, we get a pretty awful flop for us, really. I fire, he calls. The river's a fourth heart. I could fire another bluff here, but I honestly don't think he's going to be folding an awful lot. Obviously, he's not folding a flush. I'm getting pretty poor odds to bet him off a hand here. It's got to work again, so 1 in 4 times 25% of the time. So really what I've got to catch him with is sort of a 3 with no heart in it, because I don't think he's folding an ace. Whether he folds a jack is debatable, and he's obviously not folding a flush, so at this point I just decide to give up. I check back, and when he checks the river, I still don't think there's much point in betting. We can't represent a flush, and he may just call us out of curiosity more than anything else in a situation like that. Although with him checking, it does mean that he more than likely doesn't have a flush, although he may be scared with the baby flush. So overall, I'm not too unhappy with how I ended up playing that hand. Just looking over the tables, I don't currently have a lot of notes on anyone. Wes 26 on the left hand table, he's a fairly loose passive player. From what I've seen so far. Isla is obviously a fairly erratic player from what we've seen so far, and Piano Poker is a little bit of an oddball with his play. I choose not to overlimp with 7-6 here. I've got a very aggressive player in the big blind. Again, it's okay to limp along there, that's fine, but with someone as aggressive as this guy in the big blind, I don't think we're going to be able to capitalise an awful lot on our equity. We're going to move on to the left hand table now because I've got ace jack. It's been open limped pre-flop. The cutoff is isolated. I've got ace jack offsuit. I think this is a pretty standard 3-bet, so I go ahead and make it. If I can get the undergun player to fold, that's brilliant. He does look tight enough to limp fold to a 3-bet. Doesn't happen on this occasion, and Flexi calls as well. Obviously I flop an ace, so I'm perfectly happy with what's going on at this point in time. And we get called again, and obviously the river's a value bet. I don't put him on a 3 at all, and we take that down. Overall the hand was fairly uneventful, but it was important to note there that the cut-off Flexi, he didn't cap pre-flop with pocket 10s there, so it's something that we need to just keep an eye on, that if he does cap us pre-flop in the future, we really need to be paying a lot of respect to that sort of range, because it's really not a range where we can say, oh, we may have this, this, this and this. He probably doesn't. If he caps us up, he's more than likely got a very large hand going on for himself. Not a lot at the moment going on both tables. Folding some rubbish. Got M Null, who sat with me on the right hand table. I have played with him before, but that was sort of 6 months ago when I was playing on Stars before, so I can't say that he's going to remember me that well. We have a new player on the left hand table and he's just opened. Queen Jack suited, here's a really easy 3-bet, so I'm going to go ahead and make that. Always good to be a little aggressive with the guys on when you start a table. Flop a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. It's a good board to represent. We bet, he flat calls. Any decision that we might have had on the turn is taken away from us by hitting the nuts. He raises. We've obviously got just jam at this point, and we bet, and he's mostly got a 2-pair style hand on the river, I'd imagine. It's a bit annoying. We could occasionally have a jack on the river, and just notice in that hand that he had ace 10, and he delayed it till the turn, which I suppose is fairly standard play these days. You're probably going to want to peel that flop with some hands, so you're going to have to wait till the turn with some, and waiting with your strongest hands seems to make sense there. He's going to be paid off by ace king, ace queen, ace jack on the turn. The king on the turn's not a particularly good card for him, so he may want to reconsider his turn raise a little bit there, now that he only really gets paid off by ace queen and ace jack, but and king 10 obviously as well, but overall I think he played that okay. Pocket fours on the right hand table. Flop's pretty awful for our hand. I'm going to bet once, and again the turn's pretty bad for us, but I'm going to bet again, try and get ace high to fold, try and get king high to fold. It doesn't happen, so I just take a free showdown there, and he has 10-9. Not really too much to say about that, unfortunately. I'm going to keep on this table quickly for a couple of reasons. First of all, because of the poster here, I'm going to raise pocket threes, and also, as you'll notice by the call out that I made earlier, to note that Piano Poker actually opened limp pre-flop with pocket kings, so and then played really tricky post flop, so he's actually someone who's going to slow play his hands. I decide to bet here. I've got the advantage. I want to try and get as many folds as I can. Fold, call, and a fold. We actually hit a flush on the turn. I'm not enamoured with my play at all here. I actually check back the turn. I don't like that at all. My reasoning at the time was that I've not got a lot to protect against, and if I don't have to protect against anything, I may be able to induce this guy to bluff. While fine in theory, the other fact to come to mind here is there's so many pair hands that this guy can have. There's a lot of I don't know if there's a lot of value, but there's certainly some value to be made here. And to be honest, it's a pretty simple bet fold if we're raised. I'm not sure that this guy is going to be sophisticated enough to pull off a bluff on this street. The vast majority of the time he's going to have a bigger flush than a 3-high flush here. So I was pretty unhappy with myself after this hand. I felt that I could bet and then take a free showdown quite comfortably here. So it's just one of those situations where you have a bit of a flinch and you make a play that you're not happy with. It's important when you do make plays like this to get back onto your best game as fast as possible, and just forget it happened. Move on to the next hand. It's one hand out of multiple thousand that you're going to play, and in some cases millions that you're going to play throughout a year. So or a poker lifetime. So it is really important that even if you're disappointed with yourself, and to be honest, I'm actually very harsh on my own play. I'm probably harsher on my own play than I am on anyone who asks advice from me, etc. So it's alright to be a little harsh on yourself, but don't be beating yourself up during a session, because all you're going to do is knock yourself off focus, and you're going to start making even more mistakes, and that's going to be costly in the long run. So I do check back here. As I've said, I'm not a big fan of it. Obviously, I have to call the river because I've induced a bluff now, and he has a higher flush than me. Which, to be fair, is pretty much what we expected. Seven-five suited in the small blind. I'm going to let go here to a raise from the cutoff. If you just look at the right hand table that we saw there, that's not the best table at the moment. We do have one player who looks to be fairly fishy in golf drive. Piano poker plays weird, that we've seen, but Flesky and Mnol are both certainly Mnol seems to be a solid lag tag style player. Flesky is we don't really know too much about him, but he seems to be a tight taggy player. At a stake like 2-4 where the rake's fairly high, we're probably not going to get that much out of him. Even if we do have an edge on him, it might not be big enough to overcome the rake. I think that you pay about 2.5 big bets per 100 hands on PokerStars in rake at 2-4 in 6 max, so we may have an edge on this guy, but it might not be enough to overcome the rake. So the game on the right isn't brilliant. The game on the left is a bit better. These games were played sort of early afternoon UK time on a Sunday, so take that for what it's worth in terms of the game quality. They're certainly beatable, these tables, I think, but they're not the type of table where I'm going to be sort of really licking my lips at the prospect of taking hundreds of bets off the table. I would expect to have a sort of narrow to half decent edge on these tables, but it might not be a perfect situation. Right hand table, Jack 10's a perfectly good open in the cutoff. 6-5 suited on the left is a potential open, but we've got a fairly taggy player to our left and a sort of calling station to his left, so the odds of us getting through to the blinds aren't brilliant. We hit a nothing flop, but again, it's a flop where I expect to get quite a lot of folds, so I'm going to fire, and fortunately for me, both of them give up, so I take down the pot. Just the standard importance of being the pre-flop aggressor in these situations. Think we probably have time for one more major hand here, so we will wait for that to come round. Got two players clashing currently on the left hand table. Be interesting to see what they show up with. Trip 5s, which is pretty much what you'd expect when you get a raise off guys like that. Ace-8 offsuit under the gun for me is a fold. I don't like offsuit aces under the gun, to be honest. I will play ace-9 off under the right conditions, but I think that ace-8 off and below, you're really asking to get yourself in trouble. If the pot goes multi-way, you're not a fan of it, because unless you flop an ace, you're not going to be too happy, and if you get 3-bet, you're often going to be dominated. Especially if he is the guy 3-betting is positionally aware, so he knows that he's 3-betting and under the gun range. You're just in all sorts of trouble there. Left hand table, we have King Jack suited. Cut off open limps, button limps, raise for value here certainly. We get a pretty nothing flop, we bet it. We get 2 calls. I'm going to take one more shot. We could have some value in our hand here. On the right hand table, ace-8 off is a pretty simple raise as well for value. On the river, the flush comes in and it's a queen. I'm just going to check fold. Right hand table, I'm going to fire here, hope to get some folds basically. I pick up an 8 on the turn, which I bet, and 5 on the river, which I bet. And here's something that is going to be incredibly familiar to those of you who play small stakes against passive players, and it's the rather familiar, hey, where the hell did my pot go? You bet the river with second pair top kicker. Your opponent has shown no aggression. You think that everything's rosy. You've made a good value bet. Your opponent's just called. He can't really have a straight or 2 pair. So you're all ready to scoop the pot, and suddenly he shows you the best hand. It's vitally important in these sort of circumstances that you not let this get to you. This is just this is basically just the price of doing business. And the fact of the matter is, if this hasn't ever happened to you, you're not value betting thinly enough. It's one of the things that I go on about quite a lot. If a loose aggressive player has never accidentally value bet you with a better ace high or something like that, you're not calling down light enough. And if you've never been accidentally value timed yourself against a loose passive player, you're not value betting thinly enough either. So don't let this sort of thing get to you. Get back onto your A game. It'll happen. It doesn't mean that your value bet was a bad one. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that hand. So moving on from there, 7-5 offsuit in the small blind. I'm going to get rid of here for the vast majority of the time. I know the big blind's fairly weak, but he's fairly cally as well. I might want a little bit more hand than 7-5 offsuit from the small blind there, to be honest. 10-9 suited from the cutoff versus an open limp. I'm going to isolate it, and I'm going to open King-7 offsuit on the button on the right hand table as well. Flop a 9 on the left hand table, and we get 3-bet and flop nothing on the right hand table, so we're going to let go. I'm actually now going to pause the session. We're going to bring an end to part 1 of this session, and we will pick up part 2 next time. The fur will start flying in the second part. There's going to be some interesting hands for us to look at, as well as the interesting hands that we had in this session, and it'll be quite interesting just to compare the halves of the session, how the tables changed, or in this case didn't really change that much, but how we adapted to the players that we were up against. I'm going to thank everyone for watching this video. I understand there was some decent play, 1 or 2 bad plays on my behalf as well, but I hope that I explained those to you as much as I possibly could. And I look forward to your comments in the video thread. And until next time, this is Boomer for PokerStrategy.com, and thank you very much for watching.